Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tim. I'm an alcoholic. Um, Good to see some cameras on. It really helps to be able to see the faces of the people I'm talking to. Uh, so I'm an alcoholic and all sorts of other things as well. And what I'm going to be talking about today is step 12. Um, the first part, having had a spiritual awakening. Well, we've got some problems already. To talk about an awakening presupposes that before the awakening, we're asleep. To understand what waking up means, I've got to understand what being asleep. Now, obviously, before I had a spiritual awakening, as I indeed have, as far as I can tell, there's no objective test for it. So you're going to have to take my word for it on that one. It didn't appear that I was asleep. I felt very much awake for around 16 hours a day. Um, I certainly felt a lot of emotion, largely negative. Um, Operating in the world before a spiritual awakening was like being a pin cushion, and the world was pins. So whatever happened caused pain. I remember one admittedly trivial incident in 1993 when I just got sober. I was in the Sainsbury's on the uh, Finchley Road, and I saw someone buying broccoli, and I thought, I can't afford to buy broccoli, and I had a panic attack and left the supermarket. I I didn't have any resilience. I mean, that's a response to seeing someone buying a vegetable. I didn't, therefore, certainly have resilience when it came to any genuine difficulties. If you'd said to me, "Are you asleep?" I would have said, "Well, obviously not." The people who appear to be asleep are the happy ones. They seem to be the ones who are missing a trick. Um, I was convinced that the only people that saw things as they were people that were suffering, and that suffering was very, very important, um, and that people that weren't suffering were stupid and weren't paying attention. And uh, so I grew up in the 1970s and 1980s, and when Channel 4 on the television came into existence, it was the sort of uh, most modern or more modern of the two artsy channels. It did other things as well. So it had lots of artsy films, um, very grand, noble films. None of them were happy. Not one of them was happy. Good films, apparently, I was brought up to believe, were films about unhappy people who don't really resolve their unhappiness. When I got to London when I was 18, I used to go to uh, an independent film theatre. I used to go to a couple, one Riverside Studios and the other one the ICA on the Mall. And I remember going to an Emir Kusturica sequence of films for a whole weekend uh, at the Riverside Studios. And I also once signed up for a full sequence of all of the Ingmar Bergman films. I don't know if you've ever seen an Emir Kusturica film or an Ingmar Bergman film, but it's not very neither of them are a barrel of laughs. There are a couple of early Ingmar Bergman comedies, but you've got to squint very hard to find them funny, and also speak Swedish, which is a disadvantage. Anyway, that's a digression. The point is that I associated being unhappy with intelligence, insight, and nobility. And I thought the rest of the world, people that just got on with things, were somehow not quite human, not quite real, anesthetized. Um, Mercifully, in all of the above, I was quite wrong. All of that suffering was a nightmare. And the point about nightmares is, although the suffering is felt as real, what is causing the nightmare isn't. It isn't real in a fundamental, eternal sense. Things happen in the material world, I'll grant that. Um, an Indian Jesuit, Paul Coutinho, says that material reality is around 1% of the whole thing. If you're in a theatre and you're watching a play, there are, as it were, real things going on in the play, and there are real human beings playing the characters. And the real human beings playing the characters are feeling real emotions, and the people in the audience are feeling real emotions. But no one would think that the cardboard apple on the table, on the stage, is a real apple. The real apple is eaten only by the audience member on their way home. That's where the real apple is. It's not on the stage. Uh, in a sense, with the unhappiness that I used alcohol and other substances and other behaviors to anesthetize, in a sense, that unhappiness did reflect a genuine insight. And the insight the genuine insight it reflected was this, that, uh, I mean, this is the sort of famous complaint of the 14-year-old, is that the world is pointless and life is pointless. And you can cite, Marcus Aurelius and Kierkegaard and lots of people to support this. Very good. Um, it's right in a sense. You see, the mistake I made when I got sober, I used the steps to learn how to behave well in the world and to operate well in accordance with the world's systems. In other words, I learned to use the steps to scrub up well so I could get a job and study and work and progress. But it very soon became apparent, really within 3 or 4 years, that everything I achieved or everything I attained simply resulted in a further set of objectives being placed in front of me. I never got anywhere. I don't know if any of you have ever uh, climbed mountains, and I don't mean climbing mountains as in the sort of very energetic form of mountaineering one might see, say, in the Himalayas or the higher Alps, but the general sort of what Americans would call hiking in difficult terrain. And I've gone up a few mountains in some of the desert and mountain states in America. And I'm not a climber, I'm just relatively fit. And I have had this experience again and again and again that you climb up a bit, you think you're doing frightfully well, and you think you're 4/5 of the way up. And if you go round the next little peak, you'll see the peak of the mountain itself. And you get round the next little peak and you discover you're 1/5 of the way up, or 1/8. You can't believe how little terrain you have behind you and how much you have ahead. And trying to achieve happiness in the material realm by, uh, uh, well, achieving anything in the material realm is like being on a mountain where there is no ultimate peak. Wherever you get to, there's always another one. And the promise is behind the next one, there satisfaction lies. Now, uh, this isn't the end of the horror. The end of the horror, and anyone who is over 50 will recognize this, one's energies start to wane to some extent. Uh, the objectives stretch away into the distance, and you start to realize as friends around you age and die that the human mechanism is winding down. If you've looked after old people, you'll see the very slow deterioration over decades. The prognosis is not good for any of us. And the horror of happiness lying in the distant future in the material realm when one is increasingly decrepit and unable to achieve things that one could have achieved at a walk in one's 20s. This is not the horse to bet on. One very sad observation as well amongst people I've known who are materialists. And these are good, moral, intelligent, rational, hardworking people outside the fellowship. What I've seen again and again, and this is very disturbing, is you see a tragedy happening and you see the person not recovering from it and not being able to, not having the resources and being essentially broken by it. And I've seen this again and again and again without a spiritual life, without a higher power. Very, very difficult. Things start very well. The sense of futility of a materialistic existence, and I would add to that an individualistic existence, I think is well documented. If anyone's read Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus, the Greek myth of the gentleman who is condemned for eternity to pushing a stone, a rock, up to the top of a hill over the course of the day at great effort. And then at the end of the day, the rock rolls down to the other side and he has to push it up again. And he's condemned to doing this for eternity. You've got Prometheus, who is condemned for eternity to having his liver plucked out by pecked at by birds for his hubris in stealing fire from the gods. We're not the first people to spot this, and depressed 14-year-olds are not the first person to spot it. When I was in my early teenage years, I told an adult, so-called adult in my family, that I was depressed, and they said, "Oh, everyone is depressed, but eventually you get married and you have children, and you're so tired out by them, you forget about your depression." That was the philosophy. Busy, 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 busy to avoid seeing this, and then that's the end of it. Achieving things in the material realm. My observation in the small corner of Western civilization, so-called civilization I appear to be in, is that people look up greatly to achievement. And by achievement, they mean doing better than someone else, which means for every person who is achieving, there must be one or more people who have failed. The more people who have failed, the better, the greater the achievement. So achievement is always at the cost of everyone else. C.S. Lewis talks about this in The Great Sin of Pride. The reason you want X, Y, and Z is not because you want anything from it, but it's so that the other fellow doesn't get it. Whether it's a relationship or an achievement or an attainment or a career or a job, it's not the thing itself. You want someone else to be deprived of it so you can be top dog. You want to beat them. Competition. It will get better, this. But I need to lay out the ground first. So stick with it. People say the most extraordinary things, and they say them so often, you think, well, they must be true, because if they weren't true, why would so many people say them, particularly intelligent people? And one of the interesting things, there are two topics where, well, I'll give you a couple of other topics. If we have, for instance, the topics of quantum fields, or the topic of, uh, oh, I don't know, uh, athematic verbs in ancient Greek. No one but an expert on either of those would dare pronounce anything on those topics. The two topics I observe people, and I include myself in this, having a terrible temptation to pronounce on without any investigation whatsoever or minimal investigation are theology and politics. And uh, as a friend of mine says, in fact, the less I know about a political issue, the clearer my views can be, which is very good. You've read a tweet and now you have a view. Very good. Well done. You can read. That's all we've proven by this. Point of saying that is I dismissed the idea that there was anything beyond the material realm on the basis of a very simple idea. And the simple idea was this: I do not see any evidence in the material realm for there being another realm, let's say a realm of the spirit. And I thought, QED, that's the end of that discussion. I can dispense with that question forever. The thousands, the millennia of intelligent people who believe in that other realm, notwithstanding. I thought, well, I'm very smart, I'm very clever. I can't see anything. So there's nothing there. In the same way that the Russian astronaut Yuri Gagarin, he went into space, said, well, I don't see God out here, as if he was expecting to somehow. So on the basis of entire ignorance and a false conclusion, I blocked myself off from anything which might save me. And as I say, my first phase of life was essentially being depressed and seeing futility all around me. The second phase was thinking, I must have been wrong, so I'm going to make it in the material world. I'll find a way of creating a material existence as an individual, not as part of anything, as an individual, which will give me happiness and satisfaction. Of course, in the big book, it says any life based on self-will can hardly be a success. Any life based on what I think I want will fail. And that is the materialistic and individualistic. You see, the problem with the I want is that it's got I in it and it's got want in it. Individualism and materialism. To go back to my false conclusion about the other realm, if you have two realms, let's say the two realms are France and Germany, and you're in France and you say, does Germany exist? And you look around the village square you're in, I don't know, let's name a little French town, La Mastre, Pontrieux, and you look around and you say, I don't see any evidence of Germany here. Well, why would you? You're in a small village square in La Mastre or Pontrieux. The false assumption was that if there is another realm, it will constantly be proclaiming itself in the terms of this realm. Why would it? If it is a different realm, it is different. It's going to operate in accordance with different rules. It's under no obligation whatsoever to take on the rules of this realm and proclaim itself. In the same way that if you're in a kitchen and someone says, I propose that there is a dining room, you cannot see the dining room from the kitchen. They're different rooms. And say, well, I can't see a dining room here from the kitchen, therefore it does not exist. That was the level of logic that I was using. If you've ever been in an industrial kitchen, you'll notice there's an awful lot of work, there's an awful lot of bother, there's an awful lot of bustle. Why would a kitchen exist were it not for the existence of a dining room? There'd be no point. Why is it even here? The apparent futility of the material realm I've learnt through doing the steps, ironically through doing something as banal as doing the steps. The futility, the apparent futility of the material realm comes from my assumption that there is no other realm. What if this realm, the material realm, is there to serve the higher realm? Not itself. The kitchen does not serve itself. The purpose of the kitchen is to deliver up meals to the other realm, and then the people that work in the kitchen go to the other realm, and that's where they eat the meals they've been preparing in the material realm. Things start to fall into place. The other false conclusion that I drew as a teenager and the young, in my early 20s, I was going to say adult, but I wasn't an adult. I was a child in an adult's body. And this is straight from Bill's story, where he says he had trouble believing in God because he looked around at the wars and the chicanery and all the other things, and he wondered if religion had done any good, frankly. If the devil seemed the boss universal, I think is the line from the big book. And so, and this is a very, very common argument. It's presented so commonly that people have stopped even trying to attack it because it's so pervasive. Look at the world. If there is a God, how could there possibly be a God when you look at the cruelty, apparent cruelty of the material world and the apparent cruelty of mankind? To extend the analogy of the kitchen room, the kitchen and the dining room, if the kitchen is a mess, you cannot conclude that there is no, first of all, there is no dining room. There is no one in the dining room. The person in the dining room doesn't care, and the person in the dining room is not in charge. What if the person in the dining room delegated various tasks to the people in the kitchen, and the reason the kitchen is in a mess is because the people in the kitchen haven't been listening to the person in the dining room? Suddenly we have an explanation, certainly for the human suffering. C.S. Lewis, again, you could do a lot worse than to set yourself the project of reading every word that C.S. Lewis wrote several times before it sinks in. He lists, I think, in the book, The Problem of Pain. It's either the problem of pain or the weight of glory, one of the two. He lists a number of human virtues and said, if everybody on the planet displayed these virtues, humanity's problems would be solved in 10 years. Quite right. So to infer the non-existence of God from the bad behavior of people is a false conclusion, I've decided. Now, the position I've got to, the spiritual awakening, is waking up to the existence of a separate realm, waking up to the existence of a higher power, an ultimate authority in that realm. Other people, now, if you want to construe the higher power as the group or nature or anything like that, or AA as a whole, or heaven forbid, Al-Anon as a whole, that will be some higher power. Anyway, if you want to do that, that's absolutely fine. Or if your higher power is your cat or your grandfather, and it's working very, very good. I'd rather see someone have a higher power as a cat than not have a higher power at all. I'm talking about what I've come to after a number of decades in AA. Waking up to the existence of another realm, waking up to the existence of a higher power in that realm, waking up to the idea that higher power cares specifically about me uh, uh, as well, along with everyone else, not me individually, but me simply because I'm part of the mass of humanity. This is what enables me to live at peace, firstly, with my flawed, what will be my eternally flawed human nature. I don't really have any guilt or shame about the fact I'm full of flaws anymore. They're there and they need to be dealt with, but they're not a source of guilt or shame. It enables me to live in a world where uh, a lot of people are very upset most of the time, and very few people propose solutions. It's if that were all I was surrounded with, if that were all that were available to me, I would no longer be here. I couldn't have stood it. Um, uh, when I was a teenager, I actually I'm not going to go into the detail, but I was suicidal and I acted on those thoughts, sometimes in front of other people. And I would use uh, those thoughts against people as well. I weaponized that. Uh, in a sense, there's an American, born in Czech Republic, or what was to become the Czech Republic, but now American rabbi called Manis Friedman, who says when teenagers say, I didn't ask to be born, they're absolutely right. Don't contradict them. They didn't ask. Of course they didn't. But they were. Therefore, someone did or something did. And maybe existence is for that, not for oneself. The desire to kill myself uh, actually had a shred of sanity. The horror of being who I was in the world I was in, that self, what is self? Eckhart Tolle says self is mind-made false images of who we really are, mind-made false images of who we really are. The impulse to do away with that self is in a sense quite right. The mistake is to do away with the physical form in order to get rid of that false self. One doesn't have to do away with oneself physically or leave the physical plane in order to do away with that false self. How does one do away with it? The steps. And what the steps do, this is how one is brought to the higher reality. Um, when I got to step 4, I was in the most frightful, tangled mess of me and the world and all my feelings and all my thoughts, and everything was bundled up together like a bucket of sick. What step 4 started to do was to pull things apart. And it started by looking at the specific causes of upset in my life. And the first distinction it made was between other people and me. In the step 4 resentment inventory, the second column, what did Sally do? My first draft would be something like, Sally offended me. Well, no. That bundles up the action she took and the effect on me. These are two separate things. The second column turns out to be Sally glared at me from across the room. That was her action. How did I then feel as a result of that is separate. I started to be able to separate your action and its effect on me in the same way that in step 8, I say, what was my action and what was that effect on the other person? How did they feel in response to that? How did their life change detrimentally in response to that? This separation. starts to take place. And then in the third column, another separation takes place. I mentioned earlier that my sense was that I was a pincushion and the world was pins. In the third column, it says, right, we got our list of people against whom we had grievances. And we now know what they did factually, concretely, simply, clearly, what the bugger did that has upset us. And then in the third column, it says, before you start to think that they've affected you, we're going to change the language slightly. No, these didn't affect me. They affected my, then you've got 7 words or phrases: pride, self-esteem, personal relations, sex relations, ambitions, security, and pocketbooks. Which means that these upsetting behaviors of other people never affected me. They affected one or more of these 7 areas of self. If the area of self goes, or I'm detached from it, I can be unaffected. And I remember the first time, I mentioned this the other day, so that's why I suppose it's on the top of my mind. I used to go to a gloomy meeting on a Monday 30 years ago, and it was as though all the people in the room were grey washed. And Doug would walk in like a sort of technicolor creature, and people would glare at him, and he would share very, very cheerfully about how effective the program was and how well his life was going, and people would shoot daggers at him with their looks. And he was completely unaffected by it because he was detached from those 7 areas of self. Those 7 areas of self, they don't go completely, they still remain. So it doesn't matter how well I work the program, I will have a reputation amongst my fellows, as indeed will all of us. Reputation does not go. Material circumstances do not go. Objectives do not go. Other people will continue to treat us in certain ways. Personal relations, finances will remain a factor forever. But what happens is I've become increasingly, though not permanently, increasingly detached from them. But to detach from them, you've got to know what they are. And that's what the third column starts to do. What are all of my ambitions? Because they are what are causing the problem. What are all of my demands for how others should behave? What image of myself am I holding in my mind that I insist be upheld in other people's minds? To cut a long story short, what I recognized in step 4 was that it was possible to live in the world and be unaffected by what is going on by looking at the ways in which I am affected and recoiling with horror at that way of thinking, that way of believing, that way of living. Going back to the question of how the steps bring about the spiritual awakening. Steps 8 and 9, all of the steps have a very significant role to play. Each one has its own contribution. In step 5, I'd had lots of, sometimes people say, love is the answer to everything, and maybe, but one has to define what love is. I'm sure there are people that had never been told by anyone that they got to AA that they were loved. I think everybody, without exception, who comes to AA has been treated well by one or more people. One or more people have acted in the benefit of that person at some point, and that is love. I think it's untrue to say that anyone can go. I don't think one can exist on the planet without love having been shown in some form. Whether or not one realizes it or recognizes it as that is different. But people have been trying uh, to express love in various ways or express my value to try to counteract my uh, depression, anxiety, all those other things. Um, but the first moment I genuinely sensed that there was something worthwhile about me and about potentially my life was in step 5, where I read out the material on around 7 pieces of paper. Um, and I said to Doug at the end of that, because I'd heard it in a meeting, I thought it sounded very fashionable. And so I asked him, do I have any character assets? We've been talking about my character defects. Do I have any character assets? Shall we examine those? And he said, oh, you have one. I said, what is that? He said, a willingness to change. There we go. That was all I was going to get. And just a footnote for why it's absolutely deadly to try to look at assets and defects in the same exercise in step 5. The defects I came up with myself, so they are mine to admit. Any virtues I had were given by God. They are not mine to own as though I've created them myself. To equate defects and assets is to equate two things from different orders of reality. I did not make myself. All that is good in me was a gift from God. To treat that gift as my own virtue and to polish it is absolutely deadly. It's denying where it's come from. The antidote was in step 5 when Doug continued to treat me well after he knew everything about me than he had before I'd done the step 5. That in one single exercise, which took an hour or two, certainly no more than that, followed by a pizza, that did more and more effectively than the aggregate of human effort to help me in the 21 years preceding that point. What did I have to do? I had to admit my wrongs. Steps 8 and 9, the combination of forgiveness and amends, again, detached me from the suffering. I remember when I completed the last amend, I felt properly alive for the first time ever. I hadn't realized that I hadn't felt alive. I had the feeling I could go anywhere and do anything and nothing could harm me, even if my body were harmed or my circumstances were harmed, that I would be all right. When you wake up in the morning, and once you've properly woken up, if you've been having bad dreams, it is first of all self-evident that you are awake. It is also self-evident that what you were dreaming was unreal. And you do not get there, you don't wake up logically, as it were. You don't say, from within the dream, I shall analyze the dream I'm having and recognize that I am dreaming, that it's all folly, and somehow think my way to being awake. You cannot do that from within the dream. If you've ever tried to think within a dream, you are, in those states where you have a tiny amount of agency over what is going on in the dream. You cannot escape the dream. All you can do is rearrange things within it, but you discover the dream is far more powerful than you, that your agency within that dream is limited. You must wake up, but you do not wake yourself up. You discover yourself waking up. And so I didn't wake up by saying I shall wake up. I woke up by taking the actions, specifically the actions of, because there are some sort of thinking steps and some writing steps, but then there are some action steps. Step 5 is an action step. Step 9 is an action step. And 11 is an action step in that we're praying, meditating to God. But action in the sense of connecting with other people. In step 5, I connected through uh, the admission of wrongs, which the other person recognized also in themselves. Step 9 is through the admission of wrongs. This is the extraordinary thing, that my sense of self-worth did not come from saying what a jolly good fellow I was. It came from admitting wrongs. And in being the person who admits the wrongs, I separate myself from the wrongs and realize I am not those wrongs. Those were things I did, not things that I was. Very important that. So it's the admission of wrongs in 5, the admission of wrongs to the people you wronged in step 9. And then in step 12, someone says, here are all the things I've been doing wrong. And then you say, well, I've done those things wrong as well. Here, it's all through the admission of wrongs. It's not by sort of bulking ourselves up and getting spiritually hench. It's through recognizing the horror of the self one has constructed. That is the basis on which real connection takes place. And in making that connection, in that moment of connection, the self is destroyed. I don't know if you've ever been at meetings where there are people who are in their first few weeks of sobriety, and once the alcohol clears out of the system, a couple of weeks later, someone will say something, and the newcomer will burst out laughing, and then everyone else bursts out laughing. And in that moment, that newcomer's self has been destroyed. The ego has been destroyed. There's cynical laughter and cruel laughter, but the laughter you get in AA meetings is a different type of laughter. You see newcomers who are serene and say things of enormous sense at times. It's because the self has been temporarily knocked out. And when that happens, the little bubble which was enclosing the person and holding back the great tides of eternity is burst and eternity rushes in. Now the bubble gets reformed. People like their bubble. That's what I think what we're condemned. This is the Sisyphean curse, is being condemned to try to reform an identity in the world, to build ourselves back up. Having been shown a glimpse of eternity, we'll say, well, I'll improve that by building my own little bubble of self. And that you start to laugh at it, and it needs constant work. But the point is that through these actions of AA, self is destroyed. And when self is destroyed, eternity rushes in, and you realize your equality and identity with other people. And there's a curious thing. Most newcomers one talks to are frightened. I shouldn't laugh, but frightened of losing their identity if they do the program. And yet, if you've heard step 5, you'll discover that every step 5 is essentially the same. The thing that you're frightened of losing is the thing which is identical to the thing that everyone else is frightened of losing. There's nothing individual there. And then you get well or weller, and that's when you discover who you really are. That's where the individual nature starts to shine out. And there's a curious paradox in waking up, is that you discover that you're fundamentally the same as other people, except you have your own particular role to play in the same way that the cells in a body, a pancreatic cell has a different set of functions than a cell in the heart muscle or the pleura or the eustachian tubes or whatever. Each cell is doing a different thing. They have great similarities, but they each have a particular role to play. They each have a particular place in the body. They must be in the place they're in. And so the extraordinary thing in finding the oneness in an AA meeting, which is really working very well, is that far from eliminating your individuality, it finds a place for it in the whole, in the same way that each jigsaw puzzle piece, although uh, unique, no two jigsaw puzzle pieces are precisely the same. Each has a place in the whole. When the whole is produced, the individual pieces appear to disappear. Uh, one thing I've noticed I think this is a very significant point about meetings. I think there are important things that can be done with online gatherings like this one because we're people who are in different physical places. We couldn't go to the same meeting. But most of us will be living in places where we can do physical meetings as well. And one can do both these days. I do far more meetings per week than I did 5 years ago. It's because I'm doing the same number of physical meetings, plus I'm doing a whole load of online meetings, which I tuck in here and there. But the physical meeting is not to be dismissed just because we have the online variants. And the we've got the material realm and the realm of the spirit. There's this sense of unity with other people, a sense of a realm which has greater reality, which lies beyond the material nuts and bolts of cells and atoms and quantum fields. But in reaching that other realm, the material does not disappear. It's repurposed. It's placed in the context of a greater whole. The play which is going on in the theatre is not the ultimate reality. The ultimate reality lies outside the theatre, but there's no point in a theatre unless there is something going on the stage. So the play that is going on the stage is not redundant. Just because you discover there is a theatre beyond it doesn't mean you stop the play. The play goes on, but it now has a greater purpose. So the material world continues to have a purpose. But it is not it's not for itself. It is not its own purpose. My material life is not its own purpose. The reason I say that is because it's all very well, it's quite right in a sense, saying in A Course in Miracles that it is not bodies that connect, it is minds that connect, but minds need bodies to help the connection. And so one of the reasons I go to physical meetings is because I need that connection. My sponsor sent me an article about the neurological effects, the effects on the physical brain of people being in physical meetings versus online meetings with radical differences in how it affected brain patterns and so on. And what I've noticed in the last few years is I never again want to go to an AA meeting where everyone is facing the same way. I like meetings where it's in the round where you can see everyone's faces when you're sharing, and not just the person sitting at the front, but the whole room. I went to a meeting on Friday, which was in a ring, and the meeting itself was, well, it was what it was, okay? But you could see all the faces, you could see the human beings. And I was going to a meeting on a Friday where you're facing the front and you can't see any of the other people. It's like being in a room on your own. I think AA works, and there are other things that are like this as well, but I think AA works because we come together and admit what is wrong. There we go. That is it. It is not by virtue or piety that we wake up. It is by the admission of wrong and then having a good old laugh at it, not then continuing to analyze and pore over it for months and years. And as Mary Oliver says, you do not have to crawl on your knees in the desert 100 miles repenting. that is not recovery. You admit it and then you move on. When I phoned my friend James in Bristol, um, I've made the mistake on occasion in the past of calling him up and trotting out some tale of woe about the terrible things that are happening in my life. And I'll explain very carefully just to make sure he understands quite how rotten the situation is. And he'll say, well, there we have it. Anything else going on? There's no discussion. There's nothing to discuss. Um, Step 6 and 7 in the big book, as you'll know if you have read it, or even by hearsay if you haven't, is 2 paragraphs. And uh, sometimes people have the idea that the people that wrote the big book were either stupid or lazy and forgot or weren't intelligent enough to put in lots of more useful material about 6 and 7. And I think they were right to make it 2 paragraphs. Once you've recounted the full litany of horrors in steps 4 and 5, what is there to say but, ugh, this has to go. If there's any equivocation at this point, you've missed something. The problem lies in how you've done the earlier steps. To look at your step 5 and not say, this has to go. I don't know, I would not know what to say to someone that was not entirely willing at that point. Um, the waking up business. Uh, I think the ultimate thing I've woken up to is God is permanently available, which means that although there are places one can go to feel particularly connected with God, one can connect with God anywhere. And there was, if people are aware of, I think they were called the Ladybird books in the 1950s, which were little children's books which introduced aspects of the world to children in a simple way. And there was a parody series of Ladybird books in the last few years, and one of them was the something like the Ladybird Book of Meditation or Ladybird Book of Mindfulness. And there was a little skit in there about Sally, and Sally was very disappointed to discover that a yoga center had opened up at the end of her road in Chiswick, because she was hoping that her boyfriend would pay for her to go on a yoga retreat in Thailand. I've known people in AA who refuse to find God in Walthamstow or in Streatham and insist on going to the jungles of Costa Rica at enormous expense, which goes into someone else's pocket, to have a micro dose of ayahuasca administered by someone who is as they put it, a bona fide shaman. Qualified shaman is the other one, as though there's some sort of national publicly funded institute of shamans, or well as long as you can. Fair enough. If that works for you and you don't have a problem with chemicals, then maybe, try a chemical. But if you can't find God on the bus, you won't find him anywhere else. If God feels absent, I'm the one who has absented myself. God hasn't gone any. Wakey, be still and know that I'm God. Very simple line from one of the Psalms. I'd intended to talk about the second part of step 12. I'm going to suggest to Jason that we split step 12 into 3, this being the first one on carrying the message, and then one on whatever the third part is, practicing these principles in all our affairs. Of course, no one is obliged to come to the other two. You can bugger off and go and do something else if you like now. But I'm going to stop there, Jason, and invite people to ask questions if they should have any. You can ask a question in the chat. You can raise your hand if you want to raise your hand, if you can keep the question fairly brief. This is being recorded. If you don't want to be recorded, what you can do, you can put the question in the chat and then it can be addressed there. So first question up, Jason.
Yeah, hi Tim. Thanks for the share. That was a great share. My question is there's one. It's not a step 12 question, so I hope you don't mind. There's a step 9. I've been in recovery for quite a long time, and there's one step 9 that I've just have not been able to make. I've made many attempts to make it, but I haven't been able to find the person. What do you do, and how do you deal with the baggage that's left inside you from not making that particular amends?
Okay, very good question. Everyone has a list of unfindable people. They can be unfindable because you have the name, but they've just disappeared off the planet. You just can't find them. Sometimes one doesn't have a name to go on even, or one has only a first name. So everyone has these. But also it's very important to remember that for every person you can remember harming, there are half a dozen you have no recollection of who you harmed. So the fact that one's crossed off every name off the list doesn't mean that one has rectified all the harm. What one has done is done one's utmost. The line in the big book is we don't get over drinking until we have done our utmost to straighten out the past. So this is a very good example of how do you know what's God's will for you, and how do you know what is God's job to do? So what's God's business? What's my business? My business is whatever is possible for me to do. If it is not possible for me to do, it is not mine to do. Therefore, I need not feel guilty for not having done it. So one treats oneself as having been forgiven by God, not because one has done the amends, but because God is forgiving. God's forgiveness is not conditional on my doing step 9, because that would give me power over God. That would mean that I'm pulling the handle which activates God's forgiveness. And God is saying, well, I'd love to forgive you, but I can't because you're the one that's really in charge. That's not I don't think that's sound. What is the case though is I'm given the means to make amends. And it is then my job to do so. And Tom Weston talks about this. He says, it is as though you're being invited to the heavenly feast. And you knock on the door and you say, can I come in? And God says, oh, absolutely. But before you do, go and clean up your mess. And you say, can I come in and have some of the hors d'oeuvres? I won't eat the whole meal, but I'll have some hors d'oeuvres and then I'll go out and then I'll make some amends and then I'll be back. And God says, no, you can't come in at all until you've made all of your amends. Then you can come in completely. And I think that's how it works. When I've done when I get to a point where I think there's nothing else I can reasonably do, I start to feel the forgiveness that has been there already. The point about God being outside, I hope this isn't too theological, but the point about God being outside space and time is that the forgiveness existed before I was born and before I did the things which required forgiveness. So for me not to forgive myself is to say that my judgment of what I've done wrong is more valuable than God's. So God may have forgiven me, but I hold myself to higher standards than God does. And I don't think that goes down terribly well with the higher power. A friend of mine in Canada says, Sometimes when you resist God, God says, well, you have it your way then. And you have it your way until you don't want to have it your way. So you do your best and then you let it go. What I think is helpful in terms of alternative amends is you can write a letter as if to the person. You read it out to an older AA member, someone who is sensible, who has a spiritual life, who believes in God, who understands the notion of doing this. And then you keep the letter, and once a year you go down the list of people you can't find, and you say, right, is there anything I can do? And I found people at 28 years sober, 29 years sober that I periodically looked for and been unable to find. But new leads arise, new ways of creating chains of people. One of the people I had to go through a chain of 4 people to get to them. So I met someone who I knew was connected to a circle, and I gradually wormed my way in, and then I found them. Their name was different, and they lived in the Pyrenees. I mean, there was no way I could have found them without, frankly, divine intervention. It was extraordinary how that happened. The same with the other one as well. So you do your best, you put it away, and then you come back. There's a question here in the, oh dear, yes, see why you want this to be anonymous. Question in the chat. If I could please ask this question anonymously, could you please share what you've seen or your experience of people being able to get off antidepressants because they've had a spiritual awakening as a result of working the steps? Yes, that's an outside issue. I'm not qualified to speak to that question directly. And that's all I'm going to say on that. There we go. Sorry about that. There we have it. There are no other hands up. There are no other questions in the chat. Is there anything else people want to ask? Jason.
Yeah, if it's okay, I've got quite a few questions, but I'll take another one if that's all right. So the question is, I heard you talk at the Broken Elevator the day about absolute surrender. Just suggest if anyone hasn't heard that talk, it's quite a good talk. So it's a personal question, and obviously you don't have to answer the personal part of it. But the question I have for you is, you were talking about get life like deals you lots of difficult stuff. So could you maybe tell us how you've dealt with a very difficult situation? You don't need to tell what it was, but just how you dealt with it. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you. I'm going to bundle the answer in with actually that question in the chat about antidepressants, but not to talk about antidepressants, but to talk about the fact that sometimes people insist that all of the addictive behavior has to stop before any progress can be made at all. And maybe for some people that's the case. In my case, there were behaviors, non-chemical behaviors, which persisted into recovery. When I was given an adequate substitute by taking the steps and getting super involved in AA, the crutches that I was leaning on in terms of those behaviors and compulsions and activities struck me as repulsive and redundant. So AA, I think, allows for a range of different approaches to getting well. Some people take a very brutal path and go utterly cold turkey on everything, including all of the behaviors. Other people, and I'm in the second camp, there were some things which had to go straight away. Fine, fair enough. But there were other things which, by God, it was slow, embarrassingly embarrassingly slow. And I think God is very good in allowing people unsatisfactory compromises. In Concept 9, Bill W. says that most progress is achieved by a sequence of unsatisfactory compromises. You don't get the very good thing straight away. You inch towards it bit by bit by bit. So, it's not ideal if someone wants to have a spiritual awakening and is working, say, in a very, very aggressive sales job, which requires a little bit of bending of the truth. It's not ideal. Maybe they should go and work in a soup kitchen. I don't know. But God seems to enable people to have spiritual awakenings. And then when the person is 10, 15, 20, 25 years sober, changes get made in other parts of their life. Uh, when I said God is very good, is that I'm given a new place to move into before I have to fully let go of the old one. Sometimes, however, the rug is pulled out from under you in the sense of um, sudden and dramatic reversals of fortune. The big book word for a reversal of fortune is vicissitude, and it talks, I think, on page 42 about the chap's belief and trust in God and saying no later vicissitude has shaken. There have been several occasions, partly through, sometimes through an internal collapse, sometimes through a catastrophe, where a whole area of your life is simply taken from you, whether it's been a career, it's been people, it's been physical health. I was very, very ill a couple of times when I was around 7 or 8 years sober, and it was touch and go at one point. So sometimes, the great shark comes along and bites a huge chunk out of your life. The answer every single time, this is terribly boring. The answer is go to meetings, go to all of your usual meetings, go talk to your sponsor, do the steps, do your prayer and meditation in the morning. Do all the things you would normally have done if the disaster hadn't happened. And eventually a path opens up. There's a principle in physics that nature abhors a vacuum, which means if a vacuum is created, something will be sucked in to fill it. I think the important thing to do, it's very tempting when the shark comes along and bites a big chunk out of your life to say, I'm going to fix this myself now, and to rush in trying to fill the gap. Disaster. If you wait, and I've experienced this several times, if you're patient and it requires, you have to keep your nerve. If you're patient, it's as though your eyes are accustomed to the darkness and you can start to see your way through. And ultimately, what the book enjoins me, the book Alcoholics Anonymous enjoins me to do is to trust God. And the only way to do that is to trust, which means to stop wittering to myself in my mind about what I think is going on. God's never asked my opinion on anything. I'm asked not to come up with views, but to simply trust. And there is almost, I think, universal sense that people are offended at the idea that their life has no purpose. In that, if someone feels their life has no purpose, this is a very upsetting and depressing thing. This suggests that there must be a purpose in the same way that if we weren't built for food, we wouldn't be hungry. Therefore, the existence of hunger shows that we're creatures who must be capable, at least, of having the hunger satisfied. This means purpose must be possible. Similarly, fairness. People in all cultures are greatly offended by things which are unfair. They may disagree about what constitutes unfairness, but people have a visceral response to unfairness. Even if it's in their own benefit, sometimes when something is in your benefit and it is unfair, you feel terrible. You would rather forego the good you've been given in favor of the fairness, which would allow everyone to have an equal share. You put these two together, fairness and purpose. What this means is that the very keen sense of offense one feels when these two are confounded means that there must be a purpose and there must be fairness, which means that not only is purpose possible, but is necessary. Otherwise, things wouldn't be fair. So it's not that, out of 1,000 people, all the 1,000 people are shooting for purpose, but only 2 will find it. All of them must have a purpose, which means whatever is happening, whatever disaster or catastrophe happens, there is an ultimate purpose which can be served by it. Not to say that it happened in order that that greater purpose be served, but the greater purpose will use whatever happens to a greater end. And I'm seeing that happen in my own life right now. I'm not going to go into details, but out of a particular tragedy, a very curious result is arising. Helene.
Thanks, Jim. I'm Helene, I'm an alcoholic. Great talk as always. Just on step 12, you didn't touch on this, but I'd be interested in your take on it. In one of my home groups, not the one we're both involved in, as a newcomer, I'm trying to carry the message to who keeps drinking but then comes back and asks for sponsorship again. Do you have a take on that? If you're trying to help somebody and they drink and they come back to you again and again. I know the book says that if someone isn't interested in working with you, in step 12, in working with others, we let them go and let them see they can't do it on their own. But, do you have any approach you take to that?
Yeah, very good question. One could do a whole hour, maybe that's what the next hour will be, on that precise question. What I pay attention to, because it depends, unfortunately, as with most things in sponsorship, it depends on the person and the precise situation. No two situations are the same. But what I pay attention to is what I feel in my body. The body never lies. And I pick things up unconsciously, which then express themselves in bodily reactions. And sometimes you have people who've had slips and they call and you have a long talk and you just feel totally relaxed and you feel it's really helpful. Other people, you see the number call and your whole body tenses up. And now what that means and why the body is tensing up is another question. But very often, if my body tenses when I see the phone ring, or halfway through the conversation, it takes a turn and my body tenses, it's very often the case I'm not the right person to be helping them. The second point is, if I'm repeating myself, I'm wasting my time. Now, by repeating myself, often things do need to be said a couple of times, and there is such a thing as a valuable reminder. So, we're reminded daily to turn our wills and lives over to God and ask God to direct our thinking. Absolutely fine. But when you feel that you've had this particular conversation several times before and you're repeating it almost as a punishment, you know that something is amiss. And one of the best principles I've heard is if you're sponsoring someone and they keep relapsing, it doesn't matter why it's not working. The fact it's not working means that they should be asking someone else for help, because continuing to work with you may be the thing which is blocking them from finding the person that it ultimately works with. So that's all I'm going to say on that. And Jason, I'm going to have to hop off in a moment. So should we close up for today?